Good afternoon, good noon, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for coming. And thank you for participating in this fifth event of our online speaker series titled Yellow Peril Redux from Coolies to Incarceration Camps, Trade Wars, and Coronavirus. And I'm Xiaodan, a faculty member of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, Department of History, and Department of Gender Women's Studies, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And my special thanks go to UIUC affiliates. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us during your summer break. First, let me introduce briefly what the project is before I introduce Dr. David Chi, the chair of today's event here. And then Dr. David Chi will introduce our speaker, Dr. Fred Korematsu, to you. Okay, this project, we started several years ago with our curiosity about the rhetoric of yellow peril. This rhetoric dates back to the so-called Asian invasions of the late 19th century. Then the COVID-19 pandemic inspired a resurgence of this rhetoric and its consequences. The American perceptions of yellow peril, the racial bias and strategies of othering it has mobilized, intersects with intercultural misunderstandings and international interactions, the making and lifting of legal boundaries, economic development and competitiveness, technological and scientific collaboration and competition, as well as tensions between globalization and nationalism. So our project situates the yellow peril phenomenon in the US as a history of systemic racism, complicated by the US East Asian relations and by mutual understandings and misunderstandings between different cultures. We study its historical moments and developments, cultural expressions, and social consequences in the past and in the present. So this project draws on our research and teaching expertise, as well as we extend our collaboration with community partners inside and outside of Illinois. And this project, let me show you some slides. Okay. Where am I sharing? No. Okay, just a second. Here. Okay. And this is about our project. And here, this project is funded by the Call to Action to Address Racism and Social Injustice Research Program. And this program started in 2020. In July that year, our Chancellor Jones announced a $2 million annual commitment by UIUC to provide support for academic research and expansion of community-based knowledge that advances the understanding of systemic racism and generationally embedded racial disparity. So our team includes faculty members, scholars, graduate students, community leaders, undergrads. It's a team of members from different disciplines and fields. I would like to thank our GA, graduate assistant, Yang Yang, for her wonderful coordination work, and to our wonderful outreach partner, Ms. Michelle Zhang, who is the co-founder of an Asian American NGO in California, Yuanshe, the Society for Heart's Delight. Thanks to both of them, we have wonderful coordination work done. Before I pass it on to Dr. Zhi, let me provide a quick review of our past events upon the request of my GA. So we already have 4 events in the past several months, and we invited historians, legal practitioners, such as Justice Sabrina McKenna from Hawaii, film director, film historian, as well as a group of artists, museum directors, and art gallery founders to talk about how they understand yellow peril and how Asian American community reconstructs our identity. Okay, the recordings are available at UIUC's media space, and the link is here. I will copy paste it at our chat room, Zoom, later. Without further ado, let me introduce to you today's chair. Dr. David Chu is a founding director of the UIUC Asian American Cultural Center, which opened in 2005, right? This is a picture of the entrance to the center. This center is very important to us because UIUC has one of the largest and most vibrant Asian university communities in the Midwest, with almost 40% of our students, who have Asian descent. And there has been a long history of Asian American student activism since the 1970s here on campus. So this center, since the year of 2005, has been providing the campus community with space for Asian American students and faculty to share the diverse and rich culture that are a part of the Asian American experience. So Dr. Zhi received her PhD in counseling psychology and a bachelor in East Asian studies and psychology from Indiana University, an MS in psychology from Purdue University. For over 30 years, Dr. Zhi has focused on issues of diversity and inclusion in higher education, with particular emphasis on Asian American and international student communities. Dr. Zhi, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shao, for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. It's a very timely and important topic for our campus and for us nationwide. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Fred Korematsu. She's the founder and executive director of the Fred Korematsu Institute, and she's the daughter of the late civil rights icon, Fred Korematsu. Since her father's passing in 2005, Karen has carried on his legacy as a public speaker, educator, and civil rights activist. She shares her father's passion for social justice and education. In 2009, she established the Fred Korematsu Institute to advance racial equity, social justice, and human rights for all. The Institute's work has expanded from K through 12 civic education to promoting public civic engagement and participation. Karen speaks across the country promoting the Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution each January 30th. So Dr. Korematsu, thank you for joining us. I'll turn this over to you now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chi, and thank you to the University of Illinois for inviting me today. I will have to have a bit of a disclaimer here that I have a bit of a virus. We hope it's not COVID, but at least I'm not there in person, so I won't be kind of infecting anyone. But I'm excited to be with you and share this kind of this important story and advocacy that we all need to take on if we're going to make a difference. Okay, so what I was saying was, he had a description of certainly of Yellow Peril, and this was a cartoon that was created. It was a racist, color metaphor that depicts people of the East and Southeast Asia and an existential danger to the Western world. This was done during the 19th century, and noted, since you do international, that it was created by a Russian sociologist that coined the term in a French essay in 1897. And he used it to encourage European empires to invade and conquer and colonize China. So, the marginalization against Asian Americans goes back a very long ways. And then and then you come to the, 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act. And with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, racism reared its ugly head again. And in fact, not many people know that Dr. Seuss created a cartoon in February 1942 called The Fifth Column. It's a military term for soldiers who intentionally try to sabotage a unit from within. But obviously, this was the start of this type of characterization of Japanese Americans, and just the racism that reared its ugly head again. Excuse me. So in 1942, on February 19th, President Roosevelt issued this executive order 9066 that actually gave the military the authority to forcibly remove anyone that was of Japanese ancestry up and down the West Coast. And this was actually done from the San Francisco Presidio, which is now part of the National Park Service, and where the Korematsu Institute has their offices today. So we've come, full circle in taking back our history. And with the executive order, the Japanese Americans were viewed as not, that they shouldn't be here, right? To go back to where they came from. I was even, when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, children and my fellow students, even in elementary and middle school, said that to me, go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. And they depicted, the Japanese as Japanese Americans as being very, dangerous people. And people would see these posters on newsreels across the country. That's how they received their information back in those days in 1942. But this could be really the title of my father's story. I am an American, and that's what he believed in. He believed in his rights as an American citizen, and he just couldn't believe that anyone that was an American citizen would have to be forced from their homes and put into prison camps. He had studied the Constitution in high school, so he thought he had rights as an American citizen, and all due process of law was denied, and no one had access to an attorney. They were never any formal charges, and they never had their day in court. And so, the Fourth and 14th Amendments, these were the violations of that time. And, I always found it, when I especially talk to students, to, point out in the 14th Amendment that it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's what really upset my father. So my father was born, excuse me, in Oakland, California. So therefore he was an American citizen. And he grew up just like any other kid, hanging out with his friends, and helping my grandfather with the flower nursery. My grandfather was actually, my grandparents came over from Japan, early 1900s. As we do in this country, back at that time, the economy in Japan was very poor. So they recruited people in agriculture from the 5 prefectures of Japan, meaning counties that were heavily agricultural. Come to America, land of opportunity. We'll help you get started, and then of course, then we'll treat you like slaves and marginalize you and take away your privileges. But my grandfather was able to buy land before the Alien Land Law took into effect on August 10th, 1913. And this was in the industrial area of East Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. So they were very proud of what they had achieved. And so because my father had disobeyed the military orders, he was arrested, excuse me, in San Leandro in 1942. But it took almost 2 years for his case to reach the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court didn't even want to deal with the incarceration. It did reach the Supreme Court, and they threw it back down to the Court of Appeals. But on, excuse me, December 18th, 1944, the court still ruled against my father. Now, it wasn't unanimous, and that's a very important point. It was a 6-3 decision. In the other 2 Supreme Court cases of Gordon Hirabayashi and Menyasui that had to do with the curfew, the Supreme Court voted unanimous that they were guilty. But in this case, like I said, it was a 6-3 decision. And Justice Robert Jackson said, the court for all times has validated the principle of racial discrimination. He also went on to say, excuse me, that referring to my father's case, this lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for anyone to pick up and use with a plausible cause. And actually, they did that. In the Bush administration, after 9/11/2001, Attorney General Ashcroft cited my father's Supreme Court case as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them again in American concentration camps. So this is, history repeating itself. My father spoke up at that time. He was still living, and said and reminded the government, "You can't do this. You've tried to do that before, and it was wrong." So when my father actually had his day in court on November 10th, 1983, and that's coming up to be the 40th anniversary of the Quorum Nobis legal cases, which was the term that was used to reopen my father's Supreme Court case. It's a Latin term meaning an error has been made before us, an error has been made before the court. And my father said at that time that horse stalls were for horses, not for people, not for human beings. And that was really the other issue with the incarceration, that it was really inhumane. So that's, as I said, this is the press conference in 1983 that announced that they were reopening my father's Supreme Court case along with Gordon Hirabayashi and Menyasui. They had found the evidence that proved there was no military necessity, that at the time of my father's Supreme Court hearing, the Department of Justice had withheld evidence, had destroyed evidence, and had altered evidence. Also at the same time, the Commission on Wartime Relocation hearings on the incarceration was going on. It had been sanctioned by Jimmy Carter and President Carter. And the result of that was race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So on November 10th, 1983, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel and the U.S. District Court of Northern California overturned my father's conviction. And even though, excuse me, that he did not have a federal conviction, so it took almost 40 years for him to see justice. That at that time, the Supreme Court record still stood, because the Supreme Court can only reverse itself. And at the time that the Department of Justice was talking to the court, they offered actually my father a pardon. My father said, well, actually, I'm the one that should pardon the government. And this was taken from what my mother said in the documentary film of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Korematsu story, that received 2 Emmys in 2022. Sorry, in 1922. As a result of my father's conviction being overturned, it really set the precedent for the Civil Liberties Act to be signed in 1988, and which was the apology and the reparations. You know, and we're talking about reparations today. It's important to remember that we need to apologize for the injustices of the past, that we do have generational trauma. And that's important to remember because it seems like it never gets addressed. So, you know, the people like the Japanese Americans carried on this weight on their shoulders and lost their dignity. My father felt responsible the first time when he lost his case in 1944, you know, for the incarceration. And that's a lot of weight to carry. And, you know, even though he had done nothing wrong, to him, the government was wrong and he was right to take a stand. So for all his work in crisscrossing this country and carrying on with education, as I try to do now, my father received the Presidential Medal of Freedom on January 15th, 1998, which is the highest civilian honor you can receive in this country. And actually, the actual date of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday is January 15th. So that was very celebratory day at the White House. When we had the former president came into office on January 2017, he issued what's called the Muslim travel ban. Well, first it was a Muslim ban that prevented anyone that was Muslim coming over to this country. And then there was so much pushback, then they called it the immigration ban. Then there was pushback there. So then they included Venezuela and then called it the travel ban. I mean, this is what we do in this country with euphemisms and trying to really not address what the issues are. And so in 2018, there was a lawsuit of Trump versus Hawaii issued against the president. And at the time, Holly Yasui, Ben Yasui's daughter, Jay Hirabayashi, Gordon Hirabayashi's son, and I issued an amicus brief in support of disbanding this Muslim travel ban. And we wanted to remind the courts of the overreaching of power, that there's a reason that we have 3 branches of government. Also, we wanted to remind the court that my father's federal conviction had been overturned or vacated in 1983. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not, upheld the Muslim travel ban. And Chief Justice Roberts issued the majority opinion. And in his majority opinion, he said, because I think Justice Sotomayor had written this scathing dissent, and I'm always encouraging everyone, even other people besides attorneys, to read dissenting opinions because they can be very telling. And because she was outraged with this decision, but you know, it's important to realize that and to know that when Justice Roberts, when he said in his majority opinion that Korematsu had been, quote, overruled in history, that was his opinion, right? So that was what they call a legal term called dicta. It was his opinion, and it still stands. Now, it would take another Supreme Court case in order to be cited as precedent, but at the time, everyone said, "Oh, Korematsu has been overturned." Well, we were very quick to think it was, but I wrote an opinion in the New York Times that all that had happened was that the Supreme Court had replaced one injustice for another. And that's what we need to be aware of, and why we need to be advocates in making sure that we have change, and that we address these racisms and issues straight on. During the pandemic, as we know, it was called many different things. It was called the China flu or the Kung flu or whatever it was, and all these euphemisms and misinformation and disinformation, really, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice had compared at the beginning of the pandemic, the stay-at-home orders as the same as the violation of the Japanese American incarceration. She cited incorrectly Korematsu versus the United States, and said that she equated the stay-at-home orders as the same as the violation of the Japanese Americans being forcibly removed from their homes. Wrong, absolutely outright wrong, because the stay-at-home orders was for for your own protection, the protection of your family, and your protection of your community. The Japanese Americans were forcibly removed, lost all their possessions, the majority of them, and had to live in terrible, inhumane conditions. That stay-at-home orders was in the comfort of your own home. So even for a Supreme Court justice in another state to not understand history is a problem in this country. That if we don't study our history, then we're going to keep making the same mistakes. That we need to know the historical trauma as well as the facts, because they seem to be repeating over time. And that's why it takes all of us to speak up and speak out against them. So what we do at the Korematsu Institute, it's interesting because we are not a legal organization. There is the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law. And they address amicus briefs and have clinics for law students. Also, we have at the University of Hawaii, Richardson School of Law, the Fred Korematsu Professorship that's also endowed. But what we do at the Korematsu Institute is about education. That we started off really with focusing on K through 12 education, because I was realizing there wasn't information in the books even about my father in textbooks. So we worked nationally. We work with the National Council for Social Studies, which is the largest social studies organization in the United States, to try to correct the curriculum and to make the change. We're pushing to Illinois has sanctioned a AAP High history in K through 12 in their schools. I worked and succeeded in the ethnic studies as a graduating requirement for high school students in California. Now I'm working with other states, because if we don't know about each other's ethnicities and cultures, and because in a lot of ways our struggles are the same, they may be called different names, and we have different faces, but the struggles and the challenges are still the same. And what we need to do is to celebrate also the successes so that we all can work together to move forward. You know, unfortunately, the racism is alive and well, and in this country. And because now we're finding that history is trying to be even erased in some states or changed. Now we have book bans where a librarian who has a book that's in her library that has been banned can be put in prison. That's wrong. That's not about America. We have to realize that book banning went back to the time of the Holocaust, that at first they had book bans, and then it was Hitler that started ordering all the books to be burned that he didn't want, that were about, especially about Jewish people. So this is not too far away from what happened, years ago in World War II, that we keep repeating this history. And the way that we're going to make change is through education and through advocacy. So we're working to stop Asian hate, and we work with the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum, and also encouraging people to get vaccinated. I mean, the pandemic is still, people are still have COVID. I mean, I just came, I hope I don't have COVID. I was tested yesterday. We'll see. But I've had 4 vaccinations. So obviously we need stronger boosters. But we all need to work together to protect each other, and to challenges, against all this hate that we see in this country, whether it's against Asians or African Americans or Latinos, or Indigenous people. All of these issues are under the surface that, depending upon what's happening, it kind of bursts through and rears its ugly head. And that's why the education that we do, the advocacy to stop this, to work together to stop this, to stop the hate that we see, to address these challenges. Even I was just up in Sacramento at the state capitol. I've been appointed by our state superintendent of public instruction as one of the ambassadors to education. And now we're challenging textbooks to include diversity, in textbooks to make sure that they have changes. And some of the textbook companies didn't show up at our task force in the press conference because they're afraid. They're afraid of the pushback. And we even need the LGBTQ plus lesson plans in these textbooks, because that now has evolved. And it's important, as we come up to Pride in this month, that we educate people. Prejudice is ignorance. Let me repeat that. Prejudice is ignorance. And the only way to fight this is through education, is teaching our young people that we need, to understand each other's stories, to know each other's stories, to know your own story so you can appreciate other people's stories, and to respect, to show respect for our differences and not to be afraid of them, that we can work together, that we all have something to contribute. And that's what my father really believed in. And so now we have, Fred Korematsu Day, as Dr. Chi was mentioning, and it's now a day of advocacy. We're pushing to make this a day of advocacy, no matter what issues that you want to address. Of course, now we have voting. So we want people to vote. We want people to register to vote. We want people to know the issues in their own communities, not only state and national, to address those issues that are close to home, because that's how we are going to make a difference. So we now have Fred Korematsu Day in a few states. We're working for a national day. I mean, I'm sure everybody would like to have another holiday, but first was established in 2010 in California, signed by Governor Schwarzenegger. The first day was January 30th, 2011. State of Hawaii, Commonwealth of Virginia, and the state of Florida. Just don't tell that governor. And New Jersey, we just had a signing with Governor Murphy at the beginning of the year in January, and Governor Ducey, who's a Republican, also signed the legislative bill a year ago for the state of Arizona and New York City. And now I understand New York is trying to push through for Fred Korematsu Day, and the state of Michigan. The governor of past governors of Illinois have also recognized the day. So maybe you can encourage Governor Pritzker and your legislators to establish Fred Korematsu Day of civil liberties in the Constitution, because that's what it's about. It's about our civil liberties and the Constitution, that we need to keep fighting for our democracy. And what I say is that this is about all of us. And if my father were here, he would say to you to stand up for what is right and don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Korematsu. At this point, for the next 10 minutes or so, we'll do some questions and answers, have some discussion. We welcome you to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll see what kind of conversations we have. All right. Let's see, as I start to scan this.
Oh, you have one of our posters in your office.
You do, you see that?
Yeah, sorry.
Center,
That's great.
Requested a teacher packet from your institute, I don't know, 5 or 8 years ago.
Yeah. Teachers still can go online and sign up for the curriculum kit at korematsuinstitute.org.
And can you tell the audience here what people would get in that packet?
Well, they would, it's a teacher's guide with lesson plans, posters like this one, also Fred Korematsu Day, and some supplemental materials in the DVD.
Great, thank you. So we have the poster of your father in our center, and every January we try to do some kind of programming.
That's great, thank you.
Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. I want to feature one of our colleagues here, Jason Finkelman. He comments that there are several films that tell your father's story. Which of these films do you most recommend for educators? He also says, by the way, within your slideshow, you included an image of a young child. That is Yuki Llewellyn, our former Dean of Students, Assistant Dean of Students here, who was a mentor to me, advocate some 37 years on our campus. So she was a big figure here at UIUC. Little girl was featured. Jason has, our colleague here, Jason, has also curated an exhibit at our local campus museum, an exhibit about Japanese Americans that focus a lot of attention on UIUC people who were affected by internment. So, Jason, I welcome you to put that in the chat. If not, I will put a link to that in a moment. So, Dr. Korematsu, which films have you felt have been the best for educators?
Well, our major film is called Of Civil Wrongs and Rights, the Fred Korematsu story. That's the 24-minute version that's been in the curriculum kits. Also, I think we had a link on our website, but I have to kind of look to make sure it's been updated. But we have received a grant. It's actually a 60-minute film, but we received a grant now. So we're working on extending the film to bring relevancy today. So to also include the, like the issue of that, the lawsuit of Trump versus Hawaii, and some of the injustices that we're seeing today. So we hope that'll come out in 2020, maybe end of 24. There's gosh, other films. I mean, I guess I'm kind of prejudiced when it comes to that one because it received, as I said, 2 Emmys. We have a list. Actually, if you go to our website and look at media, there's another list of films there that you can look for. The one thing I just opened up the Q&A and I saw Justice McKenna. She's great. We love working together, and I want to answer her question because it's very good about generational trauma. And I didn't really say, how I learned about my father's Supreme Court case. And it was actually in high school because there was nothing in the textbooks. And you have to understand that the Japanese Americans didn't talk about their experience. It was trauma to them as well. And my friend Maya was giving a book report, and the book was called Concentration Camps USA. Interesting title. And then she goes on to say that it's about the Japanese American incarceration. And also I want to bring attention to the euphemisms, right? So we're trying to get away from internment because it's really incarceration or concentration camps. To say evacuation is not correct. If you have tornadoes or hurricanes or earthquakes, 5-year-olds can tell you that, you're removed for your own safety. That, the Japanese Americans were not removed for their own safety. They were forcibly removed. So, but then my friend Maya went on to say, but there was this one man who resisted the military orders, and it ended up to be a landmark Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. That's my name. And I have 35 pairs of eyes turning around, looking at me and shrugging my shoulders because I'm thinking it's some black sheep of the family because she never said Fred. So after class, I asked my friend and Maya, and she says, yes, this is about your father. Then, of course, I go home and ask my mother, who says, you have to, yes, that's your father. You have to wait till he gets home to ask him. And not only did my father have, in housing issues, but employment issues, redlining back in those days. And so by the time he arrived home, it was 8 o'clock at night, and I calmed down a little bit. And he just simply said, it happened a long time ago, and what he did, he thought was right, and the government was wrong. That clear and simple. And because I could see this hurt going over his face, the only thing I could ask him was, could he vote? And because voting was very important to my parents. So we didn't speak about this from 1966 to 1982, when Professor Irons visited my father with this evidence. And that's a long time because it just was too painful. And that's the experiences as we have these pilgrimages across the country at the different incarceration camps. We have these sessions with families because the generational trauma that everyone experiences from not knowing because their parents never told them, or because the racism is they're still experiencing this prejudice and this hate and this racism. And that's part of this generational trauma because, quote, my father, he was guilty because he looked like the enemy, right? So like with the coronavirus, because when it was coming, when we learned it stemmed from China. Well, because so if you were Asian in this country, then it was your fault for COVID-19, right? So this is the kind of thing that keeps happening, and that's why we need to address these issues and to keep up with the education.
Let me follow up then. Did you have many family members, Korematsu family members, who were interned, and did any of them ever want to share stories with you and your brother while you were growing up?
No, I mean this is it. No one wanted to talk about it, and which was not unusual. I mean, I find some families that do, but they're very few that really talked about this. And it was, when you carry around that burden, it's very difficult to share that. And you want, I think for my father, my father, it was like protecting his children, right? He wanted to wait until we were older, my brother and I, to understand what went on at that time. But I'm a big believer that even 5-year-olds understand. I mean, I've talked to 5-year-olds, my favorite audience. They're like sponges, and they understand. I talk in terms of what's what they know, fair and unfair, for people who have kids, and it's very simple to them. But it's about teaching respect. That I didn't think we would have to be, that at my age, that I have to be talking about respect, that we have to remember to respect each other's differences and to appreciate each other.
And now, more recently, we have other kinds of generational trauma after 9/11 and
Right.
COVID, and see Muslim bans and the investigations of people of Chinese descent who are possibly being accused of being spies. We see all sorts of trauma against people of Asian descent.
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially with the scientists. I mean, it was just I was just so outraged when that started coming up again, because at the time, years ago, my father became friendly with Wen-Ho Lee, who also had that case brought against him. And it's like you're just people just assume that you're guilty. Or that or you don't belong here, or that you're and this is part of the model minority quote myth. Talk about the yellow peril, or the model the model minority was also a term that was created by a sociologist from UC Berkeley, of all people, in 1966 in a New York Times magazine, to say, oh, the Japanese Americans are, they've really have done so well. They have assimilated. They're doing, they're working. Their kids are doing so well in school, and that's a whole myth, because a lot of families were still having problems. It wasn't all rosy, like this professor was saying. And then they tried to, in years past, of course, pin African Americans against Asian Americans, and saying to the African Americans, well, you have to do you have to do well because the Asian American students did. That's part of this. These issues of the Harvard kind of case that's going on now. Sorry.
I'll draw this parallel. Soon, maybe within the next week or so, the Supreme Court shall be making some decision about the future of affirmative action.
Correct.
The case is supposedly being brought forth by some Asian American students and their families, but in reality, they are just the faces. Behind them is a white American man, and ultra conservative, who is trying to dismantle affirmative action. So very much like the model minority myth, it is a conservative white American that's trying to use Asian Americans as a racial wedge against other communities of color.
Right, right.
And today, in reality, 75%, the latest polls are that 75% of Asian Americans do support affirmative action. And every major Asian American professional organization also is in support of affirmative action. We shall see what happens in the next week with the new Supreme Court decision, and I predict it will not be positive. And I also predict that Asian Americans will be used as a scapegoat for what's about to happen.
That's it. I mean, and this is the issue that we need to address, because Asian Americans have been using as scapegoats, and it's just totally wrong. But we need to be resilient. We all need to have the courage that even though it's kind of 3 steps forward or 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I mean, whatever that analogy is, but you get the point. But we have to, and collectively, all right. So I mean, even though my father, and you have to realize that my father disobeyed the military orders in 1942. He was vilified and ostracized from his own Japanese American community. They never supported him. And even in 1983, when his case was being reopened, because of redress and reparations, the Japanese American community at large did not support him doing this. But my father just believed that in his convictions, his moral principles of right and wrong. And when you do these things, not only, and he didn't do this just for himself, he did this for all Americans and for all Japanese Americans. He, even his own community, even though they didn't want anything to do with him, that he knew that this was wrong. And when you take on these challenges and you do this, not only for yourself, but really for others, that's when you succeed. And we have to work together now because it's become so politicized and polarized that we need to work together to make these changes.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, so let me ask you one last question from the chat to summarize this. What do you think is the biggest challenge and opportunity in Asian American civil rights today? Let's let that be the last question for you, Dr. Korematsu.
I think it's actually getting the record straight, right? It's to make sure that we challenge the misinformation and the disinformation, right? And to also this is about all of us. Yes, we're Asian Americans, but we see these challenges. We are the ones that have been marginalized. We have been, these are the ones we've all experienced these challenges, and we want to help people. It's just like the African American redress and reparations movement, right? So a lot of Asian Americans are supporting that, and that's what we need to do, is to work to get out of our silos and to work together. That's how we're going to make change.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Korematsu and Dr. Zhi. Hope in the near future we will get the record straight, and hope in the near future we can celebrate the Korematsu Day annually, and hope one day not only Asian Americans but also people from other racial and ethnic communities know who Fred Korematsu is and what the Korematsu versus USA the case is. And also thanks to Professor Zhi for your wonderful chairing and wonderful Q&A session. Thanks to every participant, and thanks to those who sent in your questions. Limited by our time, we cannot go over each of the questions, but thank you so much for your participation. We have a wonderful event. Thanks to everyone. Perfect timing, 3 p.m. And again, I would like to thank Judge Sabrina McKenna. Perhaps you notice I changed one word in our project's title from concentration camp to incarceration, thanks to Sabrina's suggestion. Great. So if you have other questions about our project, or if you want to pass any further information about Korematsu Institute or about Korematsu versus US case, you can send to me or send to my GA. We will forward to people who can answer your questions. Hey, that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.